What we are witnessing right now with the so-called collapse of Moscow's Kaliningrad land bridge is not just a logistical hiccup, it's a profound illustration of how geopolitical rivalries twist the arteries of global capitalism. Hundreds of trains packed with freight, fuel, and essential goods are now stranded as Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania shut their crossings. The capitalist press will tell you this is about security or sanctions. But let's be honest, it's about power, leverage, and the high stakes chessboard of economic warfare. When borders close, it's not just goods that stop moving, it's the illusion of global economic interdependence that begins to unravel. Think about it. Kaliningrad, that tiny yet strategic exclave of Russia, has always been an island of Moscow's power on NATO's doorstep. For years, its connection to the mainland ran through Belarus and the Lascau's Baltic corridor, a lifeline that symbolized Russia's ability to stay plugged in to Europe's economic bloodstream. But today, that land bridge is gone, choked off by politics and fear. This isn't simply about trains. It's about how capitalism's supposed efficiency depends on fragile international cooperation that can vanish overnight when empires clash. Now, here's the hook. Every time the global system fractures like this, ordinary working people pay the price. The elites in Moscow, Warsaw, and Brussels will posture, strategize, and reframe this as national defense, but the dock worker, the rail engineer, the small exporter, they're the ones watching livelihoods freeze while politicians trade sanctions like poker chips. This land bridge closure is yet another reminder that capitalism cannot guarantee stability. It guarantees only that crises will be redistributed. And what's truly remarkable is how quickly free markets become hostage to political decisions. One week, we're told the global supply chain is efficient, unstoppable, inevitable. The next week, hundreds of trains are rusting on the tracks because two governments decided to flex their muscles. The invisible hand, it seems, doesn't reach across a closed border. The market's freedom ends where state power begins. So as this situation unfolds, we should stop pretending this is just another diplomatic spat. It's a signal, a flashing warning light that the so-called global economy is little more than a patchwork of fragile dependencies maintained by constant political compromise. And when those compromises collapse, as they have now between Belarus, Poland, and Russia, we see the truth. Capitalism doesn't unite the world. It fragments it again and again at the exact points where profit collides with power. The abrupt shutdown of the Belarus and Baltic border crossings is more than a regional inconvenience. It's a seismic event that exposes the deep geopolitical fragility at the heart of modern capitalism. For decades, global trade has been marketed as an unstoppable force, transcending borders, ideologies, and even wars. But the moment political tensions intensify, those very arteries of trade seize up. What we see with the isolation of Kaliningrad is the economic equivalent of a heart attack in the global system arteries blocked by sanctions, political mistrust, and military posturing. The capitalist world economy depends on constant motion, goods flowing across borders, supply chains synchronizing continents, and markets functioning under the assumption that stability is guaranteed. Yet, Stability is never a guarantee when geopolitics dictates who gets to trade, who gets to cross, and who gets left behind. When hundreds of freight trains are stranded between Russia, Belarus, and Poland, it's not just a logistical problem, it's a symptom of capitalism's built in contradiction. The system thrives on global interconnection, but remains perpetually vulnerable to the politics of national interest. Each time a border closes, capitalism's promise of efficiency through globalization reveals itself as fiction. The corporations and investors who profit from the smooth flow of goods depend on political cooperation among states, yet those same of states are locked in zero-sum competition for power, influence, and security. In other words, the capitalist network is global in ambition, but national in control. And that tension becomes explosive whenever crises emerge. The Kaliningrad disruption shows how political decisions can instantly paralyze entire sectors of trade, transportation, and industry. It's not just trains that are immobilized, it's the illusion that markets operate independently of state power. This geopolitical choke point reminds us that every container, shipment, and contract moves not through a free market, but through borders patrolled by armed guards, customs officers, and political agendas. The rhetoric of globalization imagines a world without friction, but the reality is a system constantly interrupted by power struggles, sanctions, and alliances. The capitalist network is, therefore, not a smooth web of cooperation. It's a battlefield of competing sovereignties disguised as commerce. What happened at the Belarus border is not an exception. It's the rule that underpins the global economy. And as these geopolitical disruptions multiply, the world is forced to confront a hard truth. Capitalism's strength, its interconnectedness, is also the source of its greatest vulnerability. Kaliningrad stands as one of the most striking geopolitical anomalies in modern Europe. A Russian territory cut off from Russia itself, wedged between Lithuania and Poland, and staring directly into the NATO frontier. Its existence has always been both strategic and symbolic, representing Moscow's reach into the heart of Europe and Europe's constant unease about that presence. The recent loss of Kaliningrad's land bridge through Belarus and the Baltic states transforms this symbolic tension into a material crisis. The trains that once carried goods, fuel, and military supplies from mainland Russia now sit idle, and this physical isolation mirrors the broader political and economic isolation Russia faces in the post-Ukraine war world order. Kaliningrad's predicament is not just about geography. It's about the shrinking avenues of Russian influence and the exposure of how dependent great powers truly are on the cooperation of others. For Russia, Kaliningrad has always been a projection of strength, home to the Baltic fleet, advanced missile systems, and the constant reminder that Moscow could exert power westward even from behind NATO lines. But power, when separated from supply, begins to hollow out. The closure of the Belarus crossings severs the most efficient overland routes linking Kaliningrad to its parent state, forcing Russia to rely on costly and limited sea and air transport. That logistical squeeze turns a military asset into a potential liability. The isolation of Kaliningrad demonstrates how geopolitics can flip symbols of strength into emblems of vulnerability. In an era of sanctions, restricted transit, and frozen borders, even the most fortified outpost becomes dependent on the goodwill or at least the tolerance of its neighbors. This situation also reveals the deep contradictions in how nations define sovereignty. Russia claims control over Kaliningrad as proof of its enduring power. Yet that control now depends on access, routes through countries that are politically and militarily aligned against it. The enclave's isolation becomes a metaphor for Russia's broader struggle to sustain influence in a world increasingly divided by alliances and economic walls. Kaliningrad was meant to be a forward base of projection, but it has instead become a pressure point, a reminder that in the 21st century, territorial possession means little without open corridors of connection. The one strategic outpost now embodies the paradox of modern geopolitics. The more a state seeks to project dominance through territory, the more exposed it becomes to the disruptions of the very networks it relies upon. Whenever the gears of global politics grind to a halt, it is not the policymakers, generals, or financiers who suffer first. It is the workers whose livelihoods depend on those gears turning. The closure of Belarusian and Baltic border crossings, which has left hundreds of trains stranded and trade routes paralyzed, may appear in headlines as a geopolitical event, but on the ground, it's an economic disaster for working people. The rail engineers who maintain those trains, the logistics coordinators managing shipments, the dock workers waiting for freight, the truck drivers idling at checkpoints. These are the individuals whose daily labor sustains the global capitalism, and yet they are the first casualties when states weaponize trade routes. The irony is painful. Workers who have no voice in international strategy end up paying the price for the decisions of those who do. Every closed border creates an invisible wave of unemployment, missed wages, and financial instability that spreads far beyond the immediate conflict zone. When supply lines stop, factories halt production, ports lose throughput, and small towns that depend on trade suffer from cascading economic shock. For the corporate elite, these disruptions are temporary losses, mere adjustments on a balance sheet. But for workers, they are existential. A single border closure can erase a month's wages, threaten a family's food security, or dissolve a small business that relies on freight traffic. The political class frames these events as necessary sacrifices for national security or strategic autonomy, but those abstract terms conceal the concrete human cost borne by laborers who neither caused nor benefit from these confrontations. This dynamic lays bare one of capitalism's cruelest contradictions. The people who create real value through their work and productivity are also the most disposable when the system encounters political turbulence. The border shutdown around Kaliningrad illustrates how deeply the lives of workers are tied to geopolitical decisions made in distant capitals. They build the railways, drive the trains, and load the cargo, yet they have no control over the policies that determine whether those very systems function while governments clash over power and influence. The global working class absorbs the disruption silently, their struggles reduced to footnotes in economic reports. Each stranded train is more than a logistical failure. It represents the halted labor of thousands whose work keeps the world economy alive, but whose voices remain unheard amid the noise of statecraft and strategy. The immobilization of freight trains between Russia, Belarus, and the Baltic states exposes a truth that the champions of globalization have long sought to downplay. Global supply chains are not resilient. They are fragile, brittle systems sustained by political stability and constant cooperation. For decades, economists and corporate strategists have hailed the efficiency of just-in-time logistics, where goods flow seamlessly from factory to market with minimal delay. But that efficiency was always built on a dangerous assumption that borders would remain open, governments would act rationally, and geopolitical tensions would never truly interrupt commerce. The moment those assumptions collapse, as they have with the Belarus and Lithuania border shutdowns, the entire logistical architecture begins to crumble. Each container, each train, each shipping schedule operates within a vast, interdependent web of agreements, permissions, and invisible handshakes between nations and corporations. When one link in that chain breaks, the disruption ripples across industries, economies, and continents. The halted trains, bound for Kaliningrad, are not an isolated problem. They symbolize the systemic vulnerability of globalization itself. The global market strength depends on uninterrupted flow, yet that very flow exists only by the grace of political cooperation. When borders close, factories stall, inventories vanish, and markets panic. In an interconnected economy, a single choke point can bring entire industries to a standstill. What makes this fragility so striking is how easily it is disguised as strength. Corporations boast of streamlined logistics, reduced costs, and record efficiency, but this efficiency is achieved by cutting away redundancy, by eliminating the buffers that once absorbed shocks. The system works perfectly when nothing goes wrong and collapses instantly when something does. The Kaliningrad crisis, therefore, is not just about rail traffic, it's about the illusion of control that globalization has sold to the world. Politicians and economists alike speak of supply chain resilience, yet resilience cannot exist in a system designed for profit maximization over stability. This event reveals that globalization has not made the world more secure or connected. It has made it more interdependent and therefore more exposed. Every factory in Europe that relies on imported components, every consumer expecting seamless delivery is part of this fragile ecosystem. The stoppage of trains in Eastern Europe is a small scale example of a larger reality. A single, a political decision, a single border, or a single act of defiance can unravel the entire promise of global economic continuity in a matter of days. The closure of Belarusian and Polish border crossings and the subsequent paralysis of trade routes to Kaliningrad illustrate with striking clarity the dominance of state power over the supposed autonomy of market forces. For decades, the ideological core of capitalism has rested on the notion of free markets, the belief that economic activity operates independently of politics, guided by competition, efficiency, and the invisible hand. Yet, every time a government closes a border, enforces sanctions, or halts trade for security reasons, this myth collapses. The halted trains sitting idle on the tracks are not victims of market failure, but of deliberate political decisions. They serve as tangible proof that economic freedom exists only within the boundaries set by the state. What this moment exposes is that markets are not self-regulating ecosystems. They are political constructs sustained by laws, treaties, and power relations. Every shipment, every transaction, every contract relies on the permission and protection of governments. When those permissions are withdrawn, the freedom of the market evaporates instantly. This reality challenges one of capitalism's most cherished illusions, that profit making can transcend the nation state. In truth, markets flourish only when states allow them to, and collapse the moment those same states weaponize trade for strategic advantage. The border closures around Kaliningrad reveal that even the most globalized industries remain at their core national instruments, vulnerable to the shifting priorities of political authority. For corporations and investors to celebrate deregulation and open borders, such events are deeply unsettling. They demonstrate that no matter how vast or profitable a company may be, it remains subordinate to the geopolitical interests of governments. The state, not the market, controls the infrastructure, railways, ports, borders that sustains capitalism. When Poland and Lithuania shut down crossings, they reminded the world that political sovereignty always trumps economic liberalism. The flow of goods, the lifeblood of global commerce, can be stopped not by a market crash, but by a single executive order signed in a capital city. The Kaliningrad disruption exposes the hierarchy that capitalism tries to conceal. Profit follows power. Investors and corporations depend on stable state systems to guarantee property rights and trade routes, but those same systems can reverse direction without warning. The events on the Belarus border are not anomalies. They are reminders that the state remains the ultimate arbiter of capitalism's freedom, deciding when, where, and for whom the market may function. The crisis surrounding Kaliningrad's land bridge lays bare one of the most profound contradictions at the core of modern capitalism, the illusion that global economic integration brings unity and stability, when in truth it breeds fragmentation and conflict. Capitalism, by its very design, pushes nations and corporations to compete for dominance, resources, and markets. The rhetoric of globalization promises cooperation and shared prosperity, yet the actual practice of global capitalism pits state against state, corporation against corporation, and worker against worker. The border shutdowns between Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania are not merely temporary disruptions, they are expressions of the deeper fractures within a system that cannot reconcile profit with peace. For years, policymakers and economists have portrayed capitalism as a universal language capable of bridging political divides. Trade, they argued, would tame rivalries and bind nations together through mutual dependence. But dependence is not the same as solidarity, it is leverage. When a crisis emerges, interdependence becomes a weapon. The closure of borders, the freezing of assets, the suspension of trade routes, these are all tools of economic warfare in a supposedly integrated world. Kaliningrad's isolation is just the latest demonstration that the global economy is not a seamless network of cooperation, but a collection of fragile alliances ready to collapse the moment trust erodes. This fragmentation extends beyond geopolitics into the daily workings of capitalism itself. Corporations chase profit across borders, exploiting low wages in one region and cheap resources in another, while governments compete to attract capital with tax breaks and deregulation. The result is a world stitched together by trade, but divided by inequality. Each crisis, whether financial, military, or logistical, peels back another layer of this illusion, revealing a global system built not on unity, but on perpetual competition. The stranded trains and blocked crossings are just physical manifestations of that deeper structural chaos. Kaliningrad's predicament serves as a microcosm of a larger truth. Capitalism cannot sustain the very global order it depends on. It promises interconnectedness but thrives on division, relying on borders to control labor and capital while pretending those borders no longer matter. The fractures now visible in Eastern Europe are not anomalies. They are the natural outcomes of a system that expands through rivalry and consumes its own foundations in the pursuit of profit. Each new disruption is not the end of globalization, but evidence of its internal decay, where the drive for accumulation undermines the very networks that once made it possible. And so, as we watch this unfolding crisis around Kaliningrad, the stranded trains, the shuttered borders, the silent tracks stretching across Eastern Europe, we are reminded that what's breaking down is not merely a transport corridor, but a story the global system has long told about itself. The story that capitalism unites nations, that markets ensure peace, that economic growth outweighs political power. In reality, every border closure, every disrupted route, every abandoned freight car reveals a deeper truth. The world economy is not governed by cooperation, but by conflict disguised as commerce. If this moment teaches us anything, it is that humanity cannot continue to rely on a system that collapses every time the powerful choose confrontation over collaboration. We need an economy rooted not in domination or profit, but in planning, democracy, and solidarity. An economy that treats connection as a shared responsibility, not a weapon. Until then, the trains will keep stopping, the workers will keep paying, and the world will keep learning over and over that capitalism's bridges are never as stable as they seem. But